and that we continue to be faithful because you draw us to you and you knit our souls with love. And we thank you for it, Father. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Okay, you guys can see that, right? We started some of this on Wednesday night. Sorry about that. Trying to move this thing out of my way. There we go. We started some of this on Wednesday night, and we're gonna just kind of review. I know it was a lot of information Wednesday night, so review is good, but we won't go into the details of those first few pages that we went through. But I want to review it because I kept kind of digging and searching and trying. There was one question that was puzzling me, and that was the connection with India. So I think I have a little bit of understanding on that, and I've been kind of going back and forth with Brother Itabo in Kenya as well about it. So, so this was the passage from APEC from Josiah Litch, and he talks about the purpose. For this purpose, atheistical France was permitted to triumph. This is the expedition of Napoleon into Egypt. And let me see if I can find where it says where that might be on the next page. But it was, let me see. Bonaparte was an instrument of vengeance in the hands of the Almighty. And at the time of the end, he is presented growing up out of the revolution, rising above, and giving direction to that dreadful storm. The papal dominion was taken away in February 1798, and in May following, at the instigation of Napoleon, the French fitted out an expedition for Egypt, the command of which was given to Bonaparte. He landed in Egypt on the 1st of July and landed his army at Meribah, about 1.5 miles from Alexandria. The Turks, although unprepared for this invasion, and I mentioned this the other night, he's going to Egypt, it's Turks that are there, so we need to kind of keep that in our mind, because this is the time of the Ottoman Empire, and who was actually ruling in Egypt. So the Turks, although unprepared for this invasion, mustered what force they could in shutting the gates of the city, held out until the French forced their way through the old crumbling walls. Thus, in 1798, the King of the South pushed at him, this was Egypt, pushed at Napoleon, and after reconciling matters, however, with the Mohammedans, as well as he could, he commenced his march through Egypt to the pyramids, inside of which they arrived on the 21st of July. So we see that the Mohammedans are in Egypt. They're referred to as the Turks, the Mohammedans, and then we'll see here that here a decisive battle ensued with the Mamelukes, and I have a little bit of information that I included in this now on the Mamelukes. I sent it out the other night, though, in which Bonaparte gained an important victory. The effect was Cairo surrendered to him, and Lower Egypt was entirely conquered. In the meantime, the French fleet, which was moored by the Bay of Aboukir, was destroyed by Lord Nelson, that was the British. After settling the affairs of Egypt, he commenced in the beginning of 1799 a march into Syria. So let's see, we're gonna go ahead and we'll read more of that as we go through. So this was what I was kind of trying to figure out, is if India is a question, and Elder Parmenter had put that out there too, with looking into India and how does India fit. And what India was doing, what Napoleon was doing, let's see up here. The French campaign was Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in the Ottoman territories of Egypt and Syria, proclaimed to defend French trade interests, seek further direct alliances with Tipu Sultan, weaken Britain's access to India, and to establish scientific enterprise in the region. So Britain, from what I was reading during the lunch break, I'm very bad at history, guys. Maybe you've already seen that, but I never paid attention to history. But anyways, India was Britain ruled, kind of like, if I understood it correctly, like when they came over here to the United States, it was still under British rule. So India was under British rule, and between taxes and everything else that they were getting, that was where they were doing commerce and making the British, keeping the British wealthy in their money and their trade. Wrong words probably, but anyway, so it was financially benefiting Britain, the British, and so that's why he went out there on this expedition. So what I started to try to, I had questions on all these things because we've looked at these a couple of times. This picture here, but if what happened here in 1798 is what then caused problems throughout this history here until finally this 10-year war broke out, then we needed to know what happened here. And so in looking at India, that was, like I said, something Elder Parmenter had brought up, is looking into India. What we see when we line this up with 1989 is the issue of the Middle East and oil. And this goes back, we're going to read a few things, and I don't know if I found the total gems that we need to find. They probably need to be dug out and fine-tuned, but we'll see how far back things go between the Soviet USSR, when it was still the USSR, United States, and the Middle East, and what was going on there. So, and we know that led into the 10-year war here, and then we know that it caused problems throughout here with the Iraq war. And then you continue to go on through until eventually you have the 10-year proxy war with Syria here. So, so we're going to read a few things about the Soviet Union and back in that history. So the Soviet Union used its relationship with Europe, and this is during the Cold War. The Soviet Union used its relationship with Europe to gain economic cooperation with the Arab world during the Cold War, and its influence in the Middle East by inciting proxy conflicts between the Arab states and their Jewish neighbors. The superpowers interacted with proxy combatants, which factored into the Soviet Union's omission from Camp David Accords. The policy exposed Soviet dualism while aiming to reduce their military budget and improve their image on the world stage. They pursued an anti-Israel policy in the Arabian Peninsula. So the Camp David Accords were a pair of political agreements signed by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem. I don't know how you say it, if it's just probably not begin, but on September 17th,
Menachem.
Thank you. Oh, I was looking at the next part of that, this one where it just says begin. But yeah, I did say that wrong. Thank you very much. The 17th of September 1978, following 12 days of secret negotiations at Camp David, the country retreat of the President of the United States in Maryland. The two framework agreements were signed at the White House and were witnessed by President Jimmy Carter. The second of these frameworks, a framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, led directly to the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty. Due to the agreement, Sadat and Begin, I don't know if Begin, received the shared 1978 Nobel Peace Prize. The first framework, a framework for peace in the Middle East, which dealt with the Palestinian territories, was written without participation of the Palestinians and was condemned by the United Nations. The historian Janasagan argues that by the time Carter left office in January '81, he was in an odd position. He had attempted to break the traditional US policy, but ended up fulfilling the goals of that tradition, which had been to break up the Arab alliance, sideline the Palestinians, build an alliance with Egypt, and weaken the Soviet Union and secure Israel. And this one here, I have the link here for this whole thing. I was just trying to search out some information that might help us to shed light on this history going into 1989. And this was a Department of Defense appropriations for 1989. And it's the discussions hearings or discussions that went back and forth. And I don't know if anybody knows who Mr. Miller was. That I don't know. And then there's also General Christ. So with respect to the Persian Gulf, we are locked into a situation where are we locked into a situation where we will be constantly protecting our allies and our own ships, since we know of the importance of the crude that comes from that area? Do we see an end to that turmoil in the Persian Gulf? General Chris said there are a couple of factors. One, we have had a naval force there since 1949. I have always had responsibility to protect US flagships in the Gulf. We always follow the flag. If they put another ship under the flag, I have a responsibility to protect it. We are beginning to get more US owned and US flagged ships coming in than we have seen before. We just had the Texaco, California, a US flagged vessel come into the Gulf. They are our guys and we have to protect them. We always will have that responsibility. The second part is related to the Iran-Iraq war and how long that will go on. I think that will require a political change in one of the countries to make that happen. As far as our overall interest is concerned, about 63% of the free world's oil reserves are located there. The Soviets perhaps are also going to have to be a net importer in the late 90s. I think we will always have an interest in ensuring that we can have some say in whose hand is on the tap. To what extent we have to do that, and we know that having their hand on the tap is what is a huge part of what is going on now, is that control over the oil and seeing to it that Russia doesn't become the main exporter to Europe. To what extent we have to do that will depend upon the amount of protection necessary and how much the Russians do. I suspect that that will be variable. So Mr. Miller says you have more background than any of us on the committee, of course, but we hear so many times of the smart weapons we have and smart missiles. They are able to come to a target with speed and precision. Everything is geared with the computer now so that things can happen very fast. What I'm wondering is if we got into a hot action in the Persian Gulf, and given the type of equipment that we have, if everything broke loose over there, would we have a lengthy war, or would we be able to have that war over within days? General Chris says, which antagonists? Who would be the enemy in your scenario, sir? The Iranians or the Soviets? Mr. Miller said the Soviets at the present time. I guess the Iranians would be with them if that is the case. That is a little hard. I don't have a crystal ball. General Chris says if we got into a retaliatory action against Iran, clearly our current weapons could tear up the kinds of systems they have. The problem with that scenario is the Iranians have taken punishment for 8 years, lost a lot of equipment and replaced it. So it would be difficult for me to see that an action such as the raids into Tripoli against Gaddafi, a one-time strike, would necessarily deter them in the same sense. To me, in my area, under an economy of force strategy, success means Russian failure. The Russians, to be successful, must gain footholds on the Gulf. They must block the oil lines of communications, the shipping routes, and they must be able to coerce the Arabs into thinking it is better to work with the Russians than the United States because of the potential consequences. There are only a few places where they can accomplish those objectives where I will go, and that is where we will meet the Russians. So when we look at Napoleon and his purpose for going to Egypt, he was wanting to be have control over the Mediterranean, and Egypt gave access down through the what was being made before the Suez Canal was built, but there was called the Canal of the Pharaohs, that it's a work that had begun, and he wanted to be able to get to India and shut off trade and commerce for the British. So I don't know who's who in application, but we can see the same thing happening with oil as what happened with India. And anybody speak up if you have any comments on this as well, just in case got anything wrong here. So the 1979 or second oil crisis, and you can look it up, there were two, the other one was 1970, or oil shock, occurred when the world, due to decreased oil output in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, despite the fact that global oil supply decreased by only 4%, widespread panic resulted, driving the price far higher. The price of crude oil more than doubled to $39.50 per barrel over the next 12 months, and long lines once again appeared at the gas stations as they had in the 73, I think I said 70, in the 73 oil crisis. In 1980, following the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War, oil production in Iran nearly stopped, and Iraq's oil production was severely cut as well. Economic recessions were triggered in the United States and other countries. So this oil, I was watching a few videos on it yesterday as well. This oil crisis, I was young at the time, not even I graduated in 79. So the oil caused the problem in the United States economy, particularly because they were big on the luxury cars, the big, you used to call them boats, I don't know if you still call them boats, but those big tank cars that were gas hogs. And so it really affected the United States economy, and car sales being a big part of that, and then gas as well. So as economic recessions were triggered in the United States and other countries, oil prices did not subside to pre-crisis levels until the mid-80s. After 1980, oil prices began a 20-year decline, except for a brief rebound during the Gulf War, eventually reaching a 60% fall off during the 1990s. As with the 73 crisis, global politics and power balance were impacted. Oil exporters such as Mexico, Nigeria, and Venezuela expanded production. The Soviet Union became the top world producer. North Sea and Alaskan oil flooded the market. It seemed that the United States and Norway had many more oil reserves than forecasted in the 70s. So the Soviet Union winds up being a top world producer. And so this desire to always have control over that area, just like with, we saw with Napoleon, even going all the way back to pirates, they always wanting control over that area. And oil was the tool, and they eventually call it this one here, the oil weapon. Arab oil producing countries had attempted to use oil as leverage to influence political events on two prior occasions. The first was the Suez Canal, the Suez Crisis in 1956, when the United Kingdom, France, and Israel invaded Egypt. During the conflict, the Syrians sabotaged both the Trans-Arabian pipeline and the Iraq-Banias pipeline, which disrupted the supply of oil to Western Europe. The second instance was when war broke out between Egypt and Israel in 1967. But despite continued Egyptian and Syrian enmity against Israel, the embargo lasted only a few months. Most scholars agree that the 67 embargo was ineffective. Although some members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries supported the use of oil as a weapon to influence the political outcome, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Saudi Arabia had traditionally been the strongest supporter of separating oil from politics. The Saudis were wary of the tactic due to the availability of oil from non-Arab oil-producing countries. And in the decades leading up to the crisis, the region's conservative monarchies had grown dependent on Western support to ensure their continued survival as Nasserism gained traction. So, and I did put a little thing down here to get with Nasserism spanning the domestic and international spheres. It combines elements of Arab socialism, republicanism, nationalism, anti-imperialism, developing world solidarity, and international non-alignment. So the Saudis were wary of the tactic due to the availability of oil from non-Arab oil-producing countries. And in the decades leading up to the crisis, the region's conservative monarchies had grown dependent on Western support. So October 6, 1973, Egypt backed the Bar-Lev line in the Sinai Peninsula, and Syria launched an offensive in the Golden Heights, both of which had been occupied by Israel. during the 1967 Six-Day War. On October 12, 1973, U.S. President Richard Nixon authorized Operation Nickel Grass, a strategic airlift to deliver weapons and supplies to Israel in order to replace its material losses after the Soviet Union began sending arms to Syria and Egypt. The following day, on October 17th, Arab oil producers cut production by 5% and instituted an oil embargo against Israel's allies, the United States, the Netherlands, Rhodesia, South Africa, and Portugal. Saudi Arabia only consented to the embargo after Nixon's promise of $2.2 billion in military aid to Israel. The embargo was accompanied by gradual monthly production cuts. By December, production had been cut by 25% of September levels. This contributed to a global recession, and it's the recession we were talking about earlier, a global recession and increased tension between the United States and its European allies, who faulted the United States for provoking an embargo by providing assistance to Israel. So this is still part of the, this is back to the original Wikipedia page on Napoleon. At the time of the invasion, the Directory had assumed executive power in France. It would resort to the army to maintain order in the face of Jacobean royalists. I think we're going to skip through this. You just read the bold portions because we read this the other night, and you have the notes so you can read more of this history if you want to. But in a letter to the Directory, he suggested this would protect French trade interests, attack British commerce, and undermine Britain's access to India and the East Indies, since Egypt was well placed on the trade routes to these places. So that was why he wanted to go on this expedition. And at the time, Egypt had been an Ottoman province since 1517. So remember back in that APEC document, it tells us that in Egypt, it was the Turks or Mohammedans and also the Mamelukes. And we'll see what the Mamelukes are here in a minute. So Egypt had been an Ottoman province since 1517, but was now out of direct Ottoman control and was in disorder with dissension among the ruling Mameluke elite. In France, Egyptian fashion was in full swing. Intellectuals believed that Egypt was the cradle of Western civilization and wished to conquer it. So Napoleon wanted to go there, and he brought the scientists and such that went down there to explore. I think there was artists with him as well to go through and explore. They wanted to look into all the rich history of Alexander the Great and everything that was all the treasures that were there. So they wanted to go down there and explore in there. So here's the Mameluke, and it's said in different ways. The way it was in this way, Mamluk or Mamluk. I would assume maybe they're saying the same thing, same way. So the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad unwittingly create a group of considerable power in the Middle East. To strengthen their armies, they acquire slaves from the nomadic Turks of Central Asia. These slaves, who become known as Mamelukes from the Arabic Mamluk or owned, distinguish themselves in the service of the caliphate and are often given positions of military responsibility. Well placed to advance their own interests, they frequently take the opportunity. The first Mamluk to seize extensive power is Ahmad ibn Tulun in the early 870s, and we're going to skip through this part and come down to here. The height of the Mamluk power begins in 1250 when they again seize control of Egypt. 10 years later, they fight the Mongols. So the Mamelukes are the ones that are this dominant power, if I'm understanding correctly, in Egypt. But Egypt at this time when Napoleon goes is in disorder at the time. And it's an Ottoman Empire, but the Mamelukes are kind of acting on their own. So here's his expedition, and it was to protect French trade interests, attack British commerce, and undermine Britain's access to India and the East Indies, since Egypt was well placed on the trade routes to these places. So, and we don't see India in this particular map. But he comes down from France, and he comes in and lands in here, just right around Alexandria. and he has some of the battles that he goes through. He gets Cairo. I think that's right there. Gets Cairo, but then after he does these battles, the Battle of the Nile, loses the, well, we'll see that in a minute, loses the his fleet. Then he starts going up through Syria. And then during part of this time, he does start to take some trip down here. And I don't remember the details on that. It might be in one of the other studies, it might be in this study. So, so we're gonna skip past this and just go to what we started on the lines. Again, you can go back and refer if you want to read the details of it, but we're mainly kind of looking to get the timeline of where he's going and this journey that he went on. So in February 1798, that's the papal wound. In May 1798, he sets out on this expedition to Egypt. In July 1, he lands in Egypt. And this is Napoleon talking here. The peoples we will be living alongside are Muslims. Their first article of faith is there is no other God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Do not contradict them. Treat them as you treated the Jews, the Italians. Respect their muftis and their imams as you respected their rabbis and bishops. Have the same tolerance for the ceremonies prescribed by the Quran for their mosques as you had for the convents, for the synagogues, and for the religion of Moses and that of Jesus Christ. The Roman legions used to protect all religions. You will here find different customs to those of Europe. You must get accustomed to them. The people among whom we are going treat women differently to us, but in every country, whoever violates one is a monster. Pillaging only enriches a small number of men. It dishonors us. It destroys our resources. It makes enemies of the people who it is in our interest to have as our friends. The first city we will encounter was built by Alexander the Great. We shall find at every step great remains worthy of exciting French emulation. So he doesn't want them to go in there and pillage Egypt and make enemies of themselves. He wants them to go in there and be friends with them. So on July 1, Napoleon, aboard the ship en route to Egypt, wrote the following proclamation to the Muslim inhabitants. For too long, the Beys, these are the ones that are in charge, another name for the ones that are in charge, who govern Egypt, have insulted the French nation and covered their traitors in slanders. The hour of their punishment has come. For too long, this horde of slaves brought in the Caucasus and Georgia have tyrannized. These slaves are the Mamelukes. And I think when you're looking at I looked it up, but it's been a while, the Beys and the Mamelukes are their leaders. And the Mamelukes came from these, originally were slaves, have tyrannized the most beautiful part of the world. So if you picture what he's thinking with Egypt and all the treasures there, all the artifacts and stuff to be found, that here it is run by these Mamelukes and tyrannized the most beautiful part of the world. But God, on whom all depends, has ordained that their empire shall end. People of Egypt, they have told you that I come to destroy your religion, but do not believe it. Tell them in reply that I come to restore your rights, punish your usurpers, and that I respect God, his prophet, and the Quran more than the Mamelukes. Tell them that all men are equal before God. Wisdom, talents, virtues are the only things to make one man different from another. Wasn't it us who destroyed the Pope, who used to say that he had duty to make war on the Muslims? Wasn't it us who have at all times been friends to the great Lord and enemies to his enemies? So when the whole expeditionary force had been disembarked, Admiral Broyes received orders to take the fleet to Abu Qir Bay before anchoring the battle fleet in the old port of Alexandria, if possible, or taking it to Corfu. These precautions were made vital by the imminent arrival of the British fleet, which had already been seen near Alexandria 24 hours before the French fleets arrived. It was wisest to avoid the risks of a naval battle. A defeat could have disastrous results, and it was in the force's better interest to go by land, marching at top speed to Cairo to frighten the enemy commanders and surprise them before they could put any defense measures up in place. So Minot had been the first to set out for Egypt and was the first Frenchman to land. Bonaparte and Kleber landed together and joined Minot at night at the Maribel, in which the first French tricolor to be hoisted in Egypt was raised. Bonaparte was informed that Alexandria intended to resist him and rushed to get force ashore. At 2 a.m., he set off his marching in 3 columns, arriving by surprise beneath Alexandria's walls and ordering an assault. The enemy gave up and fled. The city had not had time to surrender and put itself in the French discretion. Despite Bonaparte's orders, the French soldiers broke into the city. So this in Josiah Litch's writings is where he says that where they put up this resistance, that this is the Turks, although unprepared for this invasion, mustered what force they could in shutting the gates of the city, held out until the French forced their way through the old crumbling walls. Thus, in 1798, the King of the South pushed at him. So the Turks in Egypt pushed against Napoleon. The push was not a destructive blow. They did push against him, but they didn't defeat him. So Bonaparte ordered his land forces to charge and attack the village of Chabris, which was captured after 2 hours of fierce fighting. The enemy fled in disorder towards Cairo, leaving 600 dead on the battlefield. After a day's rest at Chabris, the French land force continued the pursuit on 2 Thermidor. It arrived 800 meters, half a mile from the village of Mbabi. The heat was unbearable and the armies were exhausted and needed a rest, but there was not enough time, and so Bonaparte drew up 25,000 troops for battle approximately 9 miles from the pyramids of Giza. He is said to have shown his army the pyramids behind the enemy's flank, and at the moment of ordering the attack, shouted, "Soldiers, see the tops of the pyramids." In accounts written long afterwards, this phrase was altered into, "Soldiers, remember that from the top of these pyramids, 40 centuries of history contemplate you." Though historians later discovered that the pyramids were not visible from the battlefield. This was the start of the so-called Battle of the Pyramids, a French victory over an enemy force of about 21,000 Mamluks. Around 40,000 of them stayed away from the battle. The French defeated the Mamluk cavalry with a giant infantry square with cannons and supplies safely on the inside. So they're surrounded. They made this big square and put their cannons in the center of their square. In all 300 French and approximately 6,000 Egyptians were killed. The battle gave rise to dozens of stories and drawings. Dupé's brigade pursued the routed enemy and at night entered Cairo, which had been abandoned by the Beys, Murad and Ibrahim. These were leaders. On, the 22nd of July, the notables of Cairo came to Giza to meet Bonaparte and offered to hand him over the city. 3 days later, he moved his main headquarters to Cairo. Dupé was ordered to follow Murad, who had set off for Upper Egypt. An observation corps was put in place at El Kenka to keep an eye on the movements of Ibrahim, who was heading towards Syria. Bonaparte personally led the pursuit of him, beat him at the Salahi, and pushed him completely out of Egypt. And if I'm following correctly from what I've been reading, he was one of the Mamelukes or one of the Beys, one of the leaders. So then we have the Battle of the Nile on August 1st. Nelson, this was Lord Nelson from the British, discovered the French warships anchored in a strong defensive position at the Bay of Aboukir. The French believed that they were open to attack only on one side. So they're lined up in the water and they think that they can only be attacked on one side, thinking that they're safe, the other side being protected by the shore. During the Battle of the Nile, the arriving British fleet, Horatio Nelson, managed to slip half of their ships in between the land and the French line, thus attacking from both sides. In a few hours, 11 out of the 13 French ships of the line and 2 out of the 4 French frigates were captured or destroyed, and the remaining ships fled. So August 1st, you have the Battle of the Nile, and you have the French fleet is destroyed, and some are destroyed and some are captured. This disastrous event did not disconcert Bonaparte at all. Ever impenetrable, he did not allow any emotion to appear that he had not tested in his mind. Having calmly read the dispatch, which informed him that he and his army were now prisoners in Egypt because they don't have a fleet to sail back with, He said, "We no longer have a navy. Well, we'll have to stay here or leave as great men, just as the ancients did." The army then showed itself happy at this short, energetic response, but the native Egyptians considered the defeat at Abukir as fortune turning in their favor, and so from then on busied themselves to find means to throw off the hateful yoke the foreigners were trying to impose on them by force and to hunt them from their country. This project was soon put into execution. Oh, let's see. After the naval defeat at Abukir, Bonaparte's campaign remained land-bound. His army still succeeded in considering power in Egypt, although it faced repeated nationalist uprisings, and Napoleon began to behave as an absolute ruler of all Egypt. He set up a pavilion, and from within it presided over the fête de Nile. It was he who gave the signal to throw into the floats the statue of the river's fiancé. His name was Mohammed. His name and Mohammed's were mingled in the same acclamations. On his orders, gifts were distributed to the people, and he gave caftans to his main officers. So we're going to skip down here. Let's see. In a letter to a sheik in August 1798, Napoleon wrote, "I hope I shall be able to unite all the wise and educated men of all the countries and establish uniform regime based on the principles of the Quran, which alone are true and which alone can lead men to happiness." This is Napoleon saying this. Bonaparte's secretary wrote that his employer had no serious interest in Islam or any other religion beyond their political value. So he's deceitful. Bonaparte's principle was to look upon religions as the work of men, but to respect them everywhere as a powerful engine of government. So he sees religion as a powerful engine of government. If Bonaparte spoke as a Muslim, it was merely in his character of a military and political chief in a Muslim country. To do so was essential to his success, to the safety of his army, to his glory. In India, he would have to be for Ali, at Tibet for a Dalai Lama, and for China, Confucius. So shortly after Bonaparte's return from facing Ibrahim came Muhammad's birthday, which was celebrated with great pomp. Bonaparte himself directed the military parades for the occasion, preparing for this festival in the sheik's house wearing oriental dress and a turban. It was on this occasion that the Divan granted him the title Ali Bonaparte, after Bonaparte proclaimed himself a worthy son of the Prophet and favorite of Allah. Around the same time, he took severe measures to protect pilgrim caravans from Egypt to Mecca, writing a letter himself to the governor of Mecca. Even so, thanks to the taxes he imposed on them to support his army, the Egyptians remained unconvinced of the sincerity of all Bonaparte's attempts at conciliation and continued to attack him ceaselessly. Any means, even sudden attacks and assassination, were allowed to force the infidels out of Egypt. Military executions were unable to deter these attacks, and they continued. The 22nd of September, 1798 was the anniversary of the founding of the First French Republic, and Bonaparte organized the most magnificent celebration possible. On his orders, an immense circus was built in the large square in Cairo with 105 columns, each with a flag bearing the name of a department round the edge and a colossal inscribed obelisk at the center. On 7 classical altars were inscribed the names of heroes killed in the French Revolutionary Wars, whilst the structure was entered through a triumphal arch, on which was shown the Battle of the Pyramids. Here there was some awkwardness. The painting flattered the French, but aggrieved the defeated Egyptians they were trying to win over as allies. So he's going to begin here soon with his going up through to Syria. First, there's a revolt here in October 1798. There's a revolt of Cairo. They go back against him. Napoleon led the French army into Egypt, swiftly conquering Alexandria and Cairo. However, in October, discontent against the French led to an uprising by the people of Cairo. While Bonaparte was in Old Cairo, the city's population began spreading weapons around to one another and fortifying strong points, especially at the Al-Azhar Mosque. A French commander, Dominique Dupy, was killed by the revolting Cairenes, as well as Bonaparte's aide-de-camp, Sokowski. Excited by the sheiks and imams, the local citizens swore by the prophet to exterminate all and any Frenchmen they met, and all Frenchmen they encountered at home or in the streets were mercilessly slaughtered. Crowds rallied at the city gates to keep out Bonaparte, who was repulsed and forced to take a detour to get to the via the Block Gate. The French army situation was critical. The British were threatening French control of Egypt after their victory at the Battle of Nile, and that's where they destroyed all their ships. And his army were still in the field of Upper Egypt. And the generals Minot and Duguay were only just able to maintain control of Lower Egypt. The Ottoman peasants had common cause with those rising against the French in Cairo. The whole region was in revolt. A manifesto of the Great Lord was published widely throughout Egypt, stating, "The French people are a nation of stubborn infidels and unbridled rascals. They look upon the Quran, the Old Testament, and the New Testament as fables. Soon, troops as numerous as they are formidable will advance on us by land. At the same time, ships of the line as high as the mountains will cover the surface of the seas. If it pleases God, it is reserved for you to preside over the French forces in Egypt, entire destruction, as dust is scattered by the wind. There will not remain a single vestige of these infidels. For the promise of God is formal. The hope of the wicked man will be deceived, and the wicked man will perish. Glory to the Lord of the worlds." So they're revolting in Cairo and want to get the French out of there. The French responded by setting up cannons in the citadel and firing them at the area containing rebel forces. During the night, French soldiers advanced around Cairo and destroyed any barricades and fortifications they came across. The rebels soon began to push back by the strength of the French forces, gradually losing control of their areas of the city. Bonaparte personally hunted down rebels from street to street and forced them to seek refuge in Al-Azhar Mosque. Bonaparte said that he, God, is too late. "You've begun now, I will finish." He then immediately ordered his cannon to open fire on the mosque. The French broke down the gates and stormed into the building, massacring the inhabitants. At the end of the revolt, 5,000 to 6,000 of the Cairenes were dead or wounded. So you've got October, the revolt of Cairo. So I don't know, and I know that's a whole lot of information. There's a whole lot more to finish this journey. I don't know the applications that we're going to find. We do understand that this is Josiah Litch telling us that this is when the king of the south, Egypt, pushed at him, France. But France eventually came in and won, and then they went and conquered Cairo. Now you've got this revolt going on. So where we go from here on some of this history, I don't know, but I know that it has to be related. If you threading the needle of this history being India and commerce with the British, then we have to be able to see, I believe we have to be able to see then in 1989, the issue of oil in the Middle East. And there were some things that I read and I couldn't find it. I was trying to find it during lunch again too. I don't remember which website I read it on, but I want to say it was in the 1600s, but I can't remember the date. But it wasn't new. I might actually have that. Hang on one second. I don't know if I'll be able to find it. I'm pretty sure I have and if I find it later, I'll email it out. But it was one of the websites that I had open. That prior to Napoleon, it wasn't a new thing to want to go in and annex Egypt. Napoleon's just the one that went in and actually did it, but it was something they'd been wanting to do for years, to go and annex Egypt and get control of the Mediterranean. So next we have, here's the Canal of the Pharaohs, and I did put a map on here. So this is the canal that was put in here that the Pharaohs had done to work on this travel to get them into the Suez Canal. With Egypt quiet again and under his control, Bonaparte used this time to revisit Suez. Let's see, I might have that blocked. Give me just a second. We're not going to be able to see it. We get out of the slideshow. Okay, let me get down here, that map. There we go. Okay, see what we got. I had it covered up, sorry about that. So this is the Canal of the Pharaohs. With Egypt quiet again under his control, Bonaparte used this time to revisit Suez and see with his own eyes the possibility of a canal known as the Canal of the Pharaohs, said to have been cut in antiquity between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean by order of the Pharaohs. Before setting out on the expedition, he gave Cairo back its self-government as a token of its pardon. A new, I'm not sure, I didn't look up what divan is. I don't know if somebody knows what that is. I didn't look that one up. Made of 60 members replaced in the military commission. So let's go back to our slideshow. Then accompanied by the colleagues from the Institute, let's see, and followed by a 300-man escort, Bonaparte set out for the Red Sea, and after 3 days marching across the desert, he and his caravan arrived at Suez. After giving orders to complete the fortifications at Suez, Bonaparte crossed the Red Sea and on the 28th of December moved into Sinai to look for the celebrated mountains of Moses, 17 kilometers from Suez. On his return, surprised by the rising tide, he ran the risk of drowning. Arriving back at Suez after much exploration, the expedition fulfilled its aim, finding the remains of the ancient canal built by Senusret III and Nico. So he went, and this goes with his mission to try to find access to India, India being off the screen here. But he went, and then, so you've got the revolt of Cairo, and next we're going to have the march into Syria. So just before this march into Syria is when he goes and explores this canal. So the Ottoman offenses. In the meantime, the Ottomans in Constantinople, or Istanbul, received news of the French fleet's destruction at Aboukir and believed this spelled the end for Bonaparte and his expedition trapped in Egypt. Sultan Selim III decided to wage war against France and sent 2 armies to Egypt. The Ottomans planned 2 offensives against Cairo, from Syria across the desert of El Salahia Bilbis, and from Rhodes by sea landing in the Aboukir area of the port city. In the French response in January 1799, during the Canal expedition, the French learned of the hostile Ottoman movements and that Djeser had seized the desert fort of El Arish from Syrian's frontier and Egypt, which he was in charge of guarding. This history here is what left eventually the power vacuum in Egypt that allowed for this, brought about eventually the Syrian war that was from 1831 to 1841. So certain that war with the Ottoman Sultan was imminent, that he would be unable to defend against the Ottoman army, Bonaparte decided that his best defense would be to attack them first in Syria, where a victory would give him more time to prepare against the Ottoman forces. Rainier and the vanguard quickly arrived at Arish, captured it, destroyed part of the garrison, and forced the rest to take refuge in the castle. At the same time, he caused Ibrahim's Mamluks to flee and captured their camp. Bonaparte's French forces left Egypt on February 5th, 1799, and 7 days after leaving Cairo, Bonaparte too arrived at Arish and bombarded one of the castle towers. The garrison surrendered 2 days later, and some of the garrison joined the French army. So he takes he marches into Syria in January. In February, he takes El Arish. So I don't want to go back to that screen, but we'll go back there after we get through some of this. And if you can watch the time, Adriana, and let me know. But the map that showed where he was going, he went down into Egypt. He went, took Cairo, and then he went in to go explore the Suez Canal that the Pharaohs, the Canal of the Pharaohs, and now he starts his march on Syria. So he's going up through where we would know Israel to be. And El Arish was the first stop there, and he defeats it. Here's one of those maps. Good. I forgot this one was here. So he comes down, it lands in here, and this is where his fleet is destroyed. And he takes Cairo, and then he winds up and he does his exploring here to go to find the Canal of the Pharaohs, and then he starts his march up this direction here. The Siege of Jaffa was a military engagement between the French army under Napoleon Bonaparte and the Ottoman forces under Ahmed el-Jazar. On the 3rd of March, 1799, the French laid siege to the city of Jaffa, which was under Ottoman control. It was fought from the 3rd to the 7th of March, and on the 7th of March, French forces managed to capture the city. So I don't know if somebody had a comment. No?
Not on your report.
Okay. So just to review again, in July, you have Bonaparte gained an important victory. He gets Cairo surrendered to him. August 1, the Battle of the Nile, the French fleet is destroyed. They're trapped in, stuck in Egypt without a fleet to sail back home on. Then October, you have the revolt of Cairo. In January, they begin the march, and they defeat them there. And in March, in January, they march into Syria and start this quest up here. In February, they take El Arish, the first city, and then they take Jaffa. So he's marching his way up. Jaffa, after marching 100 kilometers across the desert, the army arrived at Gaza, where it rested for 2 days and then moved into Jaffa. The city was surrounded by high walls flanked by towers. Jazar had entrusted its defense to elite troops, the artillery manned 1,200 Ottoman gunners. The city was one of the ways into Syria. Its port could be used by his fleet. And that was another thing I wanted to mention too. When I was looking at I don't have all the Russia stuff put together. I just had pieces of it that I've been able to put together. But they, for Russia wanted to go into the Middle East, they wanted to have their, to be an importer of oil. They also wanted warm water ports. And I didn't look that up. Does anybody know what the difference would be to have a warm water port? The advantage, somebody here that's listening? Because that had to do with that area as well in the Middle East when it comes to Russia. So, okay, so he winds up capturing Jaffa here. Before leaving Jaffa, Bonaparte set up a divan, I think it's a group, from the city along a large hospital on the site of Carmelite Monastery of Mount Carmel to treat those of his soldiers. There's also a plague that's going on at this time. So there are many of them that he's losing a lot of his soldiers to the plague as well, whose symptoms had been seen among them since the start of the siege. A report from Generals von Rampoon on the plague's spread worried Bonaparte. To calm his army, it is said he went into the sufferers' rooms, spoke and consoled with the sick and touched them, saying, "See, it is nothing." So I thought it was interesting that there's a plague that's going through here at this time as well. From what I understood, this was propaganda that was sent out, that he went in and talked to them, but that he probably didn't. Mount Tabor from Jaffa, the army sent off the coastal town of Acre. En route, it captured Haifa and the munitions and provisions stored there, along with the castle at Jaffa, the castle of Nazareth, and even the town of Tyre, much farther up the coast. The siege of Acre began on the 18th of March, but the French were unable to take it, and it was here that the Syrian campaign came to an abrupt halt. And when I started to say that about the Syrian war, the battle in 1831 to 1841 was that the Ottomans had, or the Egyptians, the Egyptian Turks had helped in the, and we'll see that when we go through that. We're not going to do that today. We'll go through that battle. But anyways, in a deal that was made between the Ottomans and then the Egyptians, the Turks in Egypt, Syria was supposed to go to Egypt. So when they go back up to Egypt in that Syrian war, it's because they want to go up and take Syria. So, and this is all before that, building up to that. So the siege of Acre began on the 18th of March, but the French were unable to take it. And it was here that the Syrian campaign came to an abrupt halt. This wound up as well, if I remember right, being a 60-day siege on Acre. Thus, the king of the north, Syria, came against him, Napoleon, like a whirlwind, with horsemen and ships and chariots, wheeled artillery with many ships, 2 British ships, and the Turkish fleet. And he was defeated and driven back with great losses. So here you have where the king of the south pushes against Napoleon, but they're not able to keep Napoleon out of Egypt. And he begins his march to go up Syria. And when he gets to Acre, this is where they have a 60-day siege, and he's not able to defeat them. And this is where where Josiah Litch puts the king of the north coming at him like a whirlwind, the actual history. So Acre returning to a siege, Baker Bonaparte learned that Rear Admiral Peary had landed 7 siege artillery pieces at Jaffa. Bonaparte then ordered 2 assaults, both vigorously repulsed. A fleet was sighted flying the Ottoman flag, and Bonaparte realized he must capture the city before that fleet arrived with reinforcements. A 5th general was ordered, which took the outer works, planted the French tricolor on the rampart, pushed the Ottomans back into the city, and forced the Ottoman fire to relent. Acre was thus taken or about to capitulate. After feeding the war for 3 months in the heart of Syria with a handful of men, taking 40 guns, 50 flags, 10,000 prisoners, raising the fortifications of Gaza, Haifa, and Jaffa, Acre, we shall return to Egypt. And that was Napoleon. He's now going to return to Egypt. So as a retreat here from Acre, in May of 79, he begins his return back down into Egypt. Finally, after 4 months away from Egypt, the expedition arrived back at Cairo, 1,800 wounded, having lost 600 men to the plague and 1,200 to the enemy action. In the meantime, Ottoman and British embassies had brought news of Bonaparte's setback at Acre to Egypt, stating that his expeditionary force was largely destroyed and Bonaparte himself was dead. On his return, Bonaparte scotched these rumors by re-entering Egypt as if he was at the head of a triumphal army, and his soldiers carrying palm branches, emblems of victory, in his proclamation to the inhabitants of Cairo. Bonaparte told them, he is back in Cairo, he's speaking of himself, the vine guard, the head of the French army, General Bonaparte, who loves Muhammad's religion. He is back sound and well, thanking God for the favors he has given him. He has entered Cairo by the gate of victory. This day is a great day. No one has ever seen it like its likes. All the inhabitants of Cairo have come out to meet him. They have seen and recognized that it is the same commander-in-chief, Bonaparte, in his own person. But those at Jaffa, having refused to surrender, he handed them all over to pillage and death in his anger. He has destroyed all its ramparts and killed all those found there. There were around 5,000 of Jezer's troops in Jaffa. He destroyed them all. He was talking about himself. But it's interesting because where he should have been coming back as a defeated general, he comes back and seems to pretend that he's had this great victory. And I remember reading, maybe somebody else remembers this too, quite a while back, that Napoleon also blocked his soldiers from getting any kind of news of what was going on, and he fed them only that which he wanted them to hear. So they, between them and also Egypt, they wouldn't know. And he comes back and pronouncing that he's been victorious. So now he's going to leave Egypt. The land battle of Aboukir was Bonaparte's last action in Egypt, partly restoring his reputation after the French naval defeat at the same place a year earlier. That's where the ships were destroyed. With the Egyptian campaign stagnating and political instability developing back home, a new phase in Bonaparte's career was beginning. He felt that he had nothing left to do in Egypt, which was worthy of his ambition, and that as he had been shown by the defeat at Acre, the forces he had left to him there were not sufficient for an expedition of any importance outside of Egypt. He also foresaw that the army was getting yet weaker from losses in battle and to disease, and would soon have to surrender and be taken prisoner by his enemies, which would destroy all the prestige he had won by his many victories. Bonaparte thus spontaneously decided to return to France. During the prisoner exchange at Aboukir, and notably via the Gazette de Frankfurt Sidney Smith had sent, he was in communication with the British fleet, from which he had learned of events in France. As Bonaparte saw and later mythologized, France was thrown back into retreat. Its enemies had recaptured France's conquest. France was unhappy at its dictatorial government and was nostalgic for the glorious peace it had signed with the Treaty of Campo Formio. And Bonaparte, as Bonaparte saw it, this meant France needed him and would welcome him back. So, and if I remember right, I think he actually, yeah, this is it. He sneaks back and he leaves his army behind. He only shared the secret of his return with a small number of friends whose discretion and loyalty were well known. He left Cairo in August 1799 on the pretext of a voyage in the Nile Delta without arousing suspicion, accompanied by the scholars Monge and Berthelot, the painter Denon, and generals Berthier, Marat, Lannes, and Marmont. On August 23rd, a proclamation informed the army that Bonaparte had transferred his powers as commander-in-chief to General Kleber. This news was taken badly, with the soldiers angry with Bonaparte and the French government for leaving them behind. But this indignation soon ended, since the troops were confident in Kleber, who convinced them that Bonaparte had not left permanently, but would soon be back with reinforcements from France. Okay, so now you have the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on the 25th of June, 1802, between the First French Republic, then under First Count Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Ottoman Empire, then ruled by Sultan Selim III. It was the final form of a preliminary treaty signed at Paris on the 9th of October, 1801, that brought, somebody have a question? That brought to an end the French campaign in Egypt and Syria and restored Franco-Ottoman relations to the status quo antebellum. In the treaty, the Ottoman Empire also assented to the Treaty of Amiens, a peace treaty between France and the United Kingdom, which had followed the surrender of French troops in Egypt to the British at the capitulation of Alexandria. Relations between the Ottoman Empire and France had been strained with the French acquisition of the Ionian Islands in 1797 and the consequent anti-Ottoman propaganda disseminated in the Balkans by French agents. When the French invaded Egypt, the Ottomans declared war. That was the 9th of September, 1798, and subsequently signed a treaty of alliance with Russia, December 23rd. This was beginning the second coalition. During the war, the Ionian Islands were reconquered with Russian help, and a republic under Ottoman sovereignty was set up. The treaty uses three systems of dating. They have the French Revolutionary calendar, the Islamic calendar, the Gregorian calendar. The French signatory was Charles Maurice Talleyrand. We read about that on Wednesday night, and the Ottoman was Syrian Mohammed Said Galip and Fedi. After the treaty, the Ottomans retained good relations with the French. So the term status quo antebellum also statu quo antebellum, and often shortened to status quo, is a Latin phrase meaning the state existing before the war. The term status quo antebellum, and often shortened, okay, is a Latin phrase meaning the state existing before the war. So it was as if it didn't happen, if I'm understanding that correctly. Everything went back to the way that it was. So it wasn't productive, but he comes back and seems to, he lifts himself up like he's been successful. So in addition to the significance of the wider French Revolutionary Wars, the campaign had a powerful impact on the Ottoman Empire in general and the Arab world in particular. The invasion demonstrated the military, technological, and organizational superiority of the Western European powers to the Middle East, leading to profound social changes in the region. The invasion introduced Western inventions such as the printing press and ideas such as liberalism and incipient nationalism to the Middle East, eventually leading to the establishment of Egyptian independence and modernization under Muhammad Ali Pasha in the first half of the 19th century, and eventually to Nahda, or Arab Renaissance. To modernist historians, the French arrival marks the start of the modern Middle East. So it was a lot of history, probably some of it unnecessary, to get the timeline of the events that took place, because within these events are ones that we should be able to find and lay up on the line of 1989 with the rise of Islam that leads up to 2011. So this was the French arrival marks the start of the modern Middle East. And I think that might be it. Yep. Okay, it was a whole lot, and I'm sorry for taking you all through that, but I was trying to find out my own self and go through the history. Any comments or questions so far?
I'm not sure why you're apologizing.
You found it helpful?
Yeah.
I'm still struggling with some of it.
Thank you, Sister Elaine.
Huh?
I said thank you.
Yeah, so what we need to do is take that line of events, anybody that's impressed to do so, and look at 1989 and try to lay it over the events that took place there. And I started to look into it, but I don't have a lot of it put together. The most I got was at least understanding that, if I understand it correctly, that when it came to trying to break the trade routes off from the British, that it's, I don't know who's who, but it would be, if I'm understanding, the scenario that we have between Russia, the United States, and the Middle East when it comes to oil and wanting to control the oil. I had several quotes that I had been finding, but or articles, and if anybody wants them, if you want more reading, I sent a bunch of these articles off to Brother Itabo. They'll be built into some of these notes later as we try to lay that in there. But the next study is, and we're not going to do it now by no means, but we're going to try and do them during the week when we do our Wednesday studies, probably, depending on what everybody wants to do. But we'll look at the history of 1831 to 1841. And that's the first Syrian war during that 10-year proxy war. So that's all I have on that right now. I do, I might have a couple of those pages open to go through if I can get back to that window. Nile. Yeah, I don't think I do have any of them open. But I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat for anybody that wants to dig into this.
Yes, please.
There's one of them. This is in the very beginning of the study when I had the, it'd probably be better to show it to you. This one here, it's a Google book. You can read it online, and there's probably a lot of information. There was a few of these that I found to try to dig back into that history to look at 1989, and this was And then there were some that were talking pre-Cold War, or I mean during the Cold War, or what was going on. So there's got to be information in there to discover, and we know that history, in the Millerite history, if we're able to lay it correctly over a line, it should help us, lead us to the increase of knowledge on Islam, which is what we're been tasked to look at and to try to gain light on that. And then one of these things, if I can share this one real quick. This was one of the ones that was talking. It didn't give me the date and the other person that it was talking about. I can't remember who it was. But anyways, against the Orientalist backdrop, the root causes of the expedition must be sought in a more noble geopolitical strategy. The project to invade Egypt had been around for some time and had already cropped up several times as part of French plans for the domination of the Mediterranean and to desire to challenge British India. Indeed, these objectives, because he wanted to be able to attack the British, but he knew that he couldn't attack the British head on, and he needed to get other support and go get turn things around in India, that he would have India on his side, and then go back and attack the British. Indeed, these objectives were those included in the instructions issued to Bonaparte by the directors. This Egyptian plan had been mentioned several times since the beginning of the revolution, and Talleyrand, on becoming Minister of Foreign Affairs in July 1797, immediately approached the government on the subject. A month later, Bonaparte, with whom Talleyrand was secretly corresponding, wrote to the directors, "The time is coming when we will feel that we really want to destroy England. We will have to take Egypt. If we really want to destroy England, we have to take Egypt." The minister's strategic vision married perfectly with the wishes of an ambitious general who wanted to direct his career away from the viper's nest of Paris. After having decided that the project to invade England, to which he had been assigned, was unrealistic, Bonaparte sent his conclusions to the government, who finally accepted the Egyptian project, though not without debate. They also, I don't remember if it was in Josiah Litch's writings, they also liked the idea that Bonaparte was out of their hands. They didn't want him around. So that was part of why the directory sent him off there. They wanted him away. So I know that was a lot of history, and I've updated the file with some of that information that wasn't there last night on the oil in the Middle East. So I'll attach that when I send it out, so the new file, so you can save them all and keep them as anybody else that has any other files or any articles of history or anything of interest that might help us on our trying to look at Islam and the and what this increase of knowledge would be. We know that from 1989, from Acts 27, we know that the south wind blows softly, and that was when the winds were favorable. And we know that the east wind comes after. So we know that when we're in that period, if I'm understanding correctly, in that period when the king of the south is going to fall, we're having the south wind blow softly, and then Islam comes after. So it's history that we need to know. I didn't think I'd actually get through that. But I'm done, Sister Adriana.
Well, it was really good. And now I know how everyone feels, because I'm like, I can't retain all that right now, but I'm going to keep going over it, and I will be able to at some point.
That's kind of what I've been doing throughout the last few weeks, is just keep going over it. But I think once we get some of the history grasped, then we can just look at the timeline, you know what I mean? And just kind of narrow it down to the timeline and just pick out key points, the key battles and the key points. But I know there's got to be the India Middle East oil, and whatever it is to search out warm water ports. Like I said, I wonder if anybody knows other than the water's cold, there must be some sort of advantage to have warm water ports. And I don't know, I'm oblivious to that. But that was the other, huh?
So your crew could jump in the water and take a shower?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be me. I like the water warm. But that was key things, and those are in some of the documents, like I said, that I sent to Itabo, and I'll attach those to the email, and when I send it out, and finding, like, again, like I said, going through that history, trying to discover why they wound up with this proxy war going on in the Middle East to begin with. Because we've seen a lot of the different 1979 to 1989, we've seen that Russia invades Afghanistan, we've seen the Iraq War, we've seen the revolutions, all these things. But digging into how it came about this, but there was one article, let me see if I can find it real quick, if everybody doesn't mind bearing with me for a few more minutes, if I can find one of them that I sent to him. Because I'm pretty sure that I saved them all. I'm not going to find it. This was a good one. Let me pull this one up. This is modern time. Whatever you want to call it, how the Russian-Saudi oil war went awry for Putin. So we all know that was going on with the COVID-19, where there was a battle between Saudi Arabia and Russia. We have like 10 more minutes. You guys want to go through this article?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's
Okay. There was I haven't gone through and highlighted it. I literally just copied and pasted and sent it off to and copied off a few paragraphs, I think the last couple of paragraphs, so I don't have it highlighted to find them, but there was some good points in here as to what is happening with Putin today when it comes to oil. And I don't know if that was a comment or question up there. So it appears that the latest in the many seemingly immutable systems that the COVID-19 pandemic has undone is global oil markets and how the world's largest energy producers measure their own power and profits. On Sunday, after a month-long oil war that saw prices cut in half, the conflict's two main protagonists, Russia and Saudi Arabia, reached a supposed truce in which oil-producing nations will cut output by nearly 10 million barrels a day. President Trump presented himself as peacemaker and made vague notions that the United States would decrease its oil production too. This new multilateral oil pact, forged with unprecedented US involvement, would seem to be a new form of energy diplomacy with potentially deep implications at a time when the global economy is facing great turbulence and likely recession. But the truth is that the deal may prove little more than short-term measure, and Russia, the country that more than any other provoked the standoff, may end up looking like a gambler who greatly overplayed his hand. The world looked very different just a month and a half ago when Moscow and Riyadh each decided that it had an advantage over the other, with political leaders in both capitals calculating that they, and not their rivals, were better equipped to weather the financial pain of a price war. The two countries had teached loggerheads over future production cuts as part of the OPEC grouping created in 2016, which saw Russia and a handful of other oil producers, but not the United States, join existing cartel members. The logic was based on simple market economics. Producers would agree to limit supply in an effort to keep prices up. The arrangement initially worked in part. Oil prices rose from a low of $27 a barrel in 2016 to more than $60 by the end of 2019, but was less than perfect. For reasons of climate and geology, Russia's oil wells are less flexible than Saudi ones. They can't simply be turned off today and then back on again tomorrow. Decreasing output in Russia would risk damaging wells and losing some fields for years, if not forever. That meant Russian oil companies kept on pumping far more than the country's officials had nominally promised. Mikhail Krutikin, a partner at Rus Energy, a consultancy in Moscow, told me of his conversations with Russian oil engineers. How do you manage to do what OPEC requires? He recalled asking them. We keep on drilling wells and pretend that we aren't. And then they replied, laughing. So they were lying. They're supposed to all cut back, but since they're not able to just turn off their drill and then start re-drilling, they don't have the means to do that, then they had to actually keep drilling. Many leaders in Moscow, especially Igor Second, a longtime Putin confidant and head of Rosneft, the state oil giant, were opposed to any cuts at all within OPEC framework. As the logic went, by agreeing to limit the amount of oil it pumps, Russia was depriving itself of potential revenue, while as a result, high prices made the drilling of shale oil in the United States economically feasible. And the US shale producers, unbound by OPEC, could pump as much as they wanted. Second also had personal reasons for making such an argument. He wanted Rosneft to develop ambitious and expensive new oil fields in the Arctic, but as long as the company was limited by OPEC rules, those projects were impossible. Unfair or not, OPEC was at first profitable for Russia. In the course of 3 years, the agreed upon production cuts brought Russia in an additional $120 billion in hydrocarbon revenue. But as demand for oil began to fall early this year, taking prices down with it, the winking understanding that undergirded the arrangement was superseded by clear-eyed economics. In early March, Saudi Arabia demanded that OPEC members make further cuts of 1.5 million barrels a day. With prices falling, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and other powerful figures in the Saudi energy industry were less inclined to close their eyes to Russia's spotty adherence to collective reductions. While both sides would later accuse each other of brinkmanship, the standoff was set. Either Russia agrees to a new round of cuts, or OPEC falls apart, with its members pumping as much oil as they want. By that point, the effect of COVID-19 in China was already putting pressure on supply chains and decreasing global economic output. To the Kremlin, limiting production to try and keep prices up looked like a pointless or at least ineffectual pursuit. We cannot fight a falling demand situation when there is no clarity about where the bottom is. Pavel Sorkin, Russia's deputy energy minister, told Reuters, Second picked the right moment to make his argument again to Putin, bringing him a personal letter, a copy of which was obtained by Reuters, in which he argued that the OPEC deal gave a preferential advantage to the United States and thus posed a strategic threat to Russia. Second, reportedly, also told Putin that Russia needed to strike at the US shale industry and the Saudi budget at the most painful moment. That is, at a time of already softening demand for oil. The final straw may have been the clash of personalities between Mohammed bin Salman, known for his boldness, or rather recklessness, and Putin, who more than anything hates being put into a corner. Putin does not tolerate the language of ultimatums, said Vladimir Milov, who formerly served as Russia's deputy energy minister and is now an opposition politician close to Alexei Navalny, the country's main anti-Putin leader. As I imagine it playing out, the Saudis tried to pressure us and Putin told them to go to hell. On March 6th, at the meeting in Vienna, Saudi and Russian representatives failed to reach an agreement. The negotiations ended, everyone slammed the doors shut behind them. Fyodor Lukyanov, the editor of Russia in Global Affairs and a well-connected figure in Moscow foreign policy circles, told me Saudi Arabia responded not merely by producing oil at pre-OPEC levels, but also dumping 2 million barrels of additional oil, priced at a steep discount. Oil prices fell 30% in a day. The ruble lost 10% of its value compared to the dollar. Still, the prevailing attitude in Moscow in early days of March was that Saudi Arabia would have to fold first. Things will be bad for them, but we'll manage to hold on, Lukyanov said, paraphrasing the mood. The confidence hinged on the price of oil, at which each country's national budget is balanced. For Russia, that number is $40 to $45 a barrel. For Saudi Arabia, it's 80 to 85. Missing in that calculation, however, is that the high Saudi figure is based on an ambitious and costly projects like the Saudi Vision 2030 initiative, whereas the Russian number is what the state indeed needs to function without deficits. If necessary, Riyadh could limit or even cancel its excess spending and still be relatively fine. So Putin is pushed into a corner through this period. At the same time, the notion that the low prices would kill off US shale producers was shaky. In general, extracting shale oil is profitable at prices of about $50 a barrel. But unlike bloated state-owned giants like Rosneft, US shale involves myriad companies, and the ones that don't go bust are able to minimize or even shut down production for a while, then ramp it up later again, if and when prices rise, and that was something Putin couldn't do. The Putin second bet was that Russia could take on Saudi Arabia and the US oil industry, outlasting each with a combination of resources. Russia has amassed more than $560 billion in sovereign reserve funds, as well as fortitude and plain old chutzpah. Even if that seems a bold wager, Russia may have felt like it had few better options. OPEC was showing its declining power, and no realistic amount of production cuts could change that. In this context, Russia's decision to refuse additional cuts looked fairly reasonable. Let's see. But the unexpected global spread of COVID-19 would soon upend thinking in Moscow and everywhere else. Whatever logic there was became irrelevant once the virus went all over the world. The price war hit global oil markets at the same time the pandemic was reaching global proportions. Nearly every major economy in the world went into some form of shutdown. With factories closed, drivers off the roads, and commerce at a standstill, demand for oil shrank by record levels. Oil markets ended up being pushed downward by two forces at once, each of which was larger than Russia had imagined: a supply shock made more dramatic by Saudi dumping, and a virus wreaking unprecedented economic havoc. During wartime, it's better not to wage battle on two fronts at the same time. Putin and his advisors had wagered that Russia could survive a prolonged period of oil at $40 or $45 a barrel, though they've even boasted about being to survive on $25 or $30 barrel, which markets saw last month. But if things kept the way they were going, oil could have gone even lower, hitting $15 or $20 a barrel, according to some forecasts. Compared to the pre-crisis situation, an uncontrolled price war could cost the Russian budget as much as $100 billion in 2020. Balkanov said that while the OPEC rules that gave US shale producers free rider benefits may have been unjust and incorrect, the cure proved worse than the disease, destroying the market, the prices along with it, in order to give a lesson to those who are misbehaving in a dangerous overreach. So who's the one that's misbehaving here? As for those who pushed Russia towards such a confrontation, their logic is understandable, but they turned out to be naive. Putin faced another pressure. COVID-19 cases were rising exponentially in Russia, topping more than 20,000. And he had chosen not to implement a clear and all-encompassing national strategy. The country was in the middle of patchwork lockdowns, with each region nominally in charge of if and how to implement a quarantine. Putin and his advisors had also chosen not to call on Russia's vast oil reserve to support the economy. They're afraid of future shocks, whether on oil markets or global recession. and don't want to approach the next wave already having spent their reserves. But this comes at a cost, both to the economy and public health. With little energy funds from Moscow, the regions don't have the money to afford prolonged lockdowns. They're forced to choose between quarantine and the economy. Unwilling to tap Russia's financial reserves and facing a pandemic and ever worsening oil prices, Putin became inclined to make a deal. His shift in mood was matched by an increasing urgency from bin Salman and Trump, whose economies were also suffering. For Putin, an additional goal was to see the United States become a participant rather than a free rider in global mechanisms to hold up oil prices. The Russian position, Lukyanov explained, was that the United States should be involved and take some sort of obligations on itself. In that sense, with the United States now a stakeholder in global oil politics, the agreement became minimally acceptable to Russia. Trump said that the US will lower production, even taking on some of Mexico's obligations to limit oil output. The details of the agreement, however, reveal its dangers for Russia. Both it and Saudi Arabia will cut oil production by 2.5 million barrels a day, far more than the 500,000 barrels Putin rejected last month. Under the old OPEC deal, Russia effectively produced 1 million more barrels than Saudi Arabia. Now the two countries will produce the same amount. Moreover, none of the US commitments was spelled out with any specificity. It's possible that the natural decrease in US production due to falling prices will be counted as the country's contribution. Russia was destined to leave the OPEC arrangement one way or another, but it should have done so gradually and peacefully without such a scandal. Now, he said, Russia will pay greatly for this mistake. In comments to the RBC, a business news channel in Moscow, Leonid Fidim, the vice president of Lukoil, the largest private oil company in Russia, compared the deal with the 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when the Bolsheviks had to reach a humiliating and difficult agreement with Germany. Perhaps Russia can take consolation in the fact that quite soon the entire notion of a cartel may be outmoded. After all, Sunday's agreement aims to cut global production by 10%, but coronavirus-related shocks are expected to push demand down by 30%. If even the most far-reaching oil deal in recent memory can't hold up, then what can? So I thought it was interesting you have this reference to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, if everybody remembers that. And I might be able to find that and pull it up here quickly.
Yeah, that was surprising.
Yeah, it's let me get to my screen here, and then I'll share it. Because that was here, lined up with the Spanish flu, lined up with COVID-19. So that's one article. And there's a few others. There's some stuff on Wikipedia I've been reading and just trying to better understand all their connections. But, and I'm really slow at this, so if anybody, to me, you've got, if we go to Daniel 11:40 and we use Josiah Litch's history, I'm gonna ask a question because I don't know. You go by, Daniel 11:40, you go by Josiah Litch, you have the king of the south, the king of the north, and you have him. So you have Egypt, Syria, or the Turks, Ottoman Empire, and then you have France. So you have 3 players. So at least, at the very least, in my naive mind, you have 3 players here, right? Middle East, Russia, and the United States.
Yes, that's what it appears to be.
Yeah, it's what I thought. And then one other thing, let me find a verse here that's been on my mind, but I've never figured it out. Where is it? I know where it's at. Hosea. And I've never broken this verse down, but maybe the Lord will open this one up soon. This one here, this is Hosea chapter 12. And I know we need to read the chapter before and go on and to read it more in context, but and put it into the, look at the historical, what it is. I think I shared this before with a few people, but we had to look at the historical of what the actual was. To have Ephraim feedeth on wind, and followeth after the east wind. He daily increaseth lies and desolation, and they do make a covenant with the Assyrians, and oil is carried into Egypt. So I've always, for a few years, thought that has to have something to do with what goes on in the Middle East. And we know that Ephraim, on some lines, if it still stands, on some lines, Ephraim was the United States. I just don't know if that even was accurate, because that was a while back. But he feedeth on the wind. You've got the south wind, and then you have the east. You have a wind, and then you have the east wind. And it just, I'm thinking whether or not we're not going to break it down today by no means, but just another verse to put out there if anybody wants to look at it, because you've got a wind there. We know that we have a south wind that blows softly, and then an east wind. So there's the different players in here, and then you've got the Assyrians and you've got Egypt. So just another thing that I haven't figured out either. So any comments? A warm water port, thank you. Allows you to carry on trade and commerce throughout the winter. Okay, because they are available year round. Warm water ports can be a great geopolitical and economic interest. So that's what Russia wants, not just the oil, but the warm water ports. And that was in some of the articles, the other articles I read, with ports in St. Petersburg and Valdez being notable examples. Russia was in desperate need of a warm water port because of their climate. Many ports were iced over for 6 months out of the year. And then Elder Tess talking about the geopolitical implications of the natural gas pipeline between Russia and other countries in Europe, like Germany, and how Syria was an important player in the situation. Yeah, I have that. I don't know which file it's in, but I have that they were in the Brazil classes. If I can find it, I'll try to remember to send it out when I send out the audio and the video, that she showed that, because that has to do with the Syrian war, the 2011 to 2021. And it had to do with what Obama did. When Obama actually tried to get in to go through Syria, they said no. Maybe somebody remembers those details. I have to go back and reread those notes. And then when Russia wanted to go in through there, then they said yes. It was Iran, I think. There's Egypt and Turkey. Yeah.
I have a thought. Very good study. Taking a lot of notes on this. Thank you, Sister Elaine. I'm thinking of the oil issue. I mean, oil isn't a big issue right now with the virus.
Well, it is to them because it's.
I mean, if the price is dropping, then, Russia sounds like economically they're in worse shape than we are. And Saudi Arabia, of course, they're in there too, but the main players, I think, would be Russia and the United States. But Russia, it said in that article that especially Russia is really hurting.
Yeah.
They're really being affected by it for sure.
And
It should just be temporary.
Huh?
It should just be temporary, though.
Well, it's temporary as long as the virus doesn't continue to get worse and worse, because then it all depends on how much commerce is being done, traded.
Right.
If there's nobody traveling, and the world, it's world trade all over the world.
And that affects a lot, though, for them financially, with nobody using oil.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's where it is right now. And it could become worse because, with the second wave of coronavirus coming. Of course, the United States and Russia, I was reading a little bit about Russia with coronavirus, and it's really been bad over there. We're the number one country, though, in the world right now with the highest rate of coronaviruses.
Yeah.
I think I was reading somewhere in the news that Europe was going to ban people from Russia and the US from coming over.
Yeah, I saw that. They're going to open back up, but not to us.
Exactly,
Yeah.
not to us or Russia.
Are we ever the laughing, or Russia too? We're the,
Yeah.
we become the laughing stock. There's so many places where I've seen that in the Bible, that the Lord will, he's going to do it to the church and to the nation and make them a byword and a laughing stock. And people hiss as they go by, if everybody remembers those.
Yeah, I remember that.
They showed these charts of these different countries and how they're curved, you know, it curved over, and they're flatlined, you know, like they've gone back down. And America is still at the top, and it's moving higher. And it's like they can't believe that America is supposed to be like, you know, the home of the free and the intelligent and everything, and they're the ones that are the worst. And of the whole world is amazing.
You know, when you have a pandemic, you don't go back, well, my constitutional rights. It's got nothing to do with people dying like flies, nothing to do with it. But they want to now pull in on the Constitution, my constitutional rights, say I don't have to wear a mask. And they're partying and drinking, and you see the results.
I mean, I see now it's like everybody is, you know, Dr. Fauci and all the authorities are just, you know, please, people, wear a mask, you know? And not just a few months ago, they were actually saying, don't wear a mask. Isn't that funny? And it's like, now they can't, you know,
I think from what I've been picking up, maybe somebody else caught this, that they're talking, there was a couple of reports that came out that said that there's a lot more cases than what they knew. It's meaning that the percentage of the death rate is lower, but what they're finding is that there's, with all the testing that's going on, is a lot of young people under the age of 35 that actually are without symptoms and carry it.
they're going to be carriers to take it to their grandparents.
Yeah,
And the
so
older people, and then the older people are going to start dying again.
so
The younger kids can get through it, most of them. I mean, if they don't have any pre-existing conditions. I mean, even if you're young and you have pre-existing conditions, even if it's obesity, you have a very strong possibility of not making it.
yeah. That brings me to my, I'm supposed to maybe go see Jesse tomorrow, and I was kind of hesitant because I haven't been around anybody. I go to the store maybe a couple of times, and that's about it. And because I know I'm not around anybody, but I do know that, you know, she's careful, she wears a mask, but she does have a few friends that she's still around. And if any of them wound up, you know, I have faith in the Lord, but I also don't want to tempt the Lord by God and go out and, you know, I look at some of those people that just, who else saw that article of the family? There was like 16 of them or 17 of them that just recently they had a surprise birthday party for someone in May, and like 16 of the family members.
Yeah. And their grandparents got it. Like so many of them got just from that one party.
Yeah. And they actually, I read the article, they actually were practicing social distancing, if I remember right.
Didn't the father die?
I don't know if anybody did yet, but he was.
There's one where the father died, a whole family, but the father died.
He might not have made it. I know that one of them, the older one, was. They were. When I read it, he didn't sound good.
And just to add to that, Governor Newsom was shocked. I was talking with one of my private clients like the other day, and we were discussing these things, and Governor Newsom said that he was shocked when the numbers came back, or the stats came back, that more people are more cases are spiking from people, from family members gathering together than there are people who are attending bars. Like, people are getting the spread of COVID-19 is more from family gatherings than people who are, you know, going out to the bars, which was opposite of what he would have expected. But the thing is that he's not saying that everybody go, you know, to the bar or anything like that. He's actually saying that everybody keep, you know, stay home and, you know, do proper precautions because people are not listening. But the point of it was just that it's the family gathering. It's like, because Father's Day was not too long ago, and people were wanting to go, you know, celebrate Father's Day, families, and things like that. So it's really interesting. Well, I found that really interesting.
Yeah, that's what has me. Those things are the very things that have me thinking about whether or not I should go over to Jesse's tomorrow. And I have something I need to go pick up from her. I just put another article in there. This one, it's a Wikipedia one, Soviet Middle Eastern Foreign Policy During the Cold War. That was one of the ones I was reading earlier today. And I think there's one other one. Yeah, a brief guide to Russia's return to the Middle East. So I was trying to look into the history of what brings them all together, and then causes all the conflict. So from what I understand, though, Russia wanted the warm water ports and to have control. Soviet Union was losing control in Europe. This is one of the articles I remember reading. Losing their control during the Cold War, and it was like they were, the way I understood what I was reading, it's like they're anticipating, I don't know if they're anticipating, but they wanted to get their hand in the Middle East. But they wanted to be in the Middle East specifically, though, just to put pressure on the West. So it was, and when they talk about, maybe somebody understands this better than I do, when they talk about the West, sometimes they're talking about Western Europe, sometimes they're talking about us. How do you know the difference?
Context?
Huh?
Do you know the answer?
Context.
What was that?
Context? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, context. Okay. Yeah, I barely heard you. It was like really low.
I'm using.
Yeah, because there was a couple articles that I was reading, a couple of spots that I was reading where it's talking about that. They during the Cold War, they were trying to mingle into the Middle East, mostly just to cause problems for the West. And I was assuming it meant us because it was referring to superpowers.
When was this?
This was back during the Cold War. And it might be in one of the articles I just posted in there.
Oh yeah, because it was Western and Eastern bloc of Europe. So
it might have been.
Yeah, they talk about the West because that's the part that was important.
Okay.
Because Europe was.
Well, I think it was referring to superpowers in one of those articles. And if it's talking about two superpowers, it would be referring to us, right?
Well, wasn't the United States became the sole superpower in 1989, but I don't know.
So, because it was a battle between the two until then.
Yeah, but the U.S. was on the side of Western Europe.
Okay.
So they were kind of both the same thing.
Okay. Okay.
Because they were allies.
Yeah, so I think it was one of those last two articles that I put in there that was talking about some of that. I only was reading some of it this morning and last night, but didn't get any of it into the notes. I just saved them all. But it might help us in digging up the information on Islam. And the other question I had posed this to Brother Itabo. If, like what I was showing you, my thoughts on India, and if you're going to thread the needle of Islam from, in 1989, you have to go all the way through, you thread the needle and you know the end from the beginning. Would you have to then be able to thread the needle of India in that situation on into 1840? Would you have to be able to, for this to be a valid application, do you have to see India and an interchange going on with India?
That's a good question.
Okay, good. It wasn't just
I
me.
thought I heard Elder Tuss at one point say that they all do have to go through 1989. I might be wrong, but I thought I heard her say that.
Well, yeah, in our line from 1989 all the way through, yeah, you have to be able to thread the needle all the way back to 1989. But what I'm looking at is the 1798 history, where you've got Napoleon going on this expedition specifically to try to get better relations with India and block the trade with Britain, because India was actually ruled by Britain and they wanted to block their cash cow. And so would you then have to be able, in order to use what I'm suggesting now, and looking at oil in the Middle East in 1989, and then helping out to determine Islam here at the end, would you have to be able to thread the needle of India from 1798 all the way through to 1840? That's if I put the question right.
Well, if I'm following the logic of Elder Tassin, I would say yes.
You would have to. Okay,
That would be my opinion, only my opinion, but logically, because she shows that you have to be able to pin it all the way through our line from 1989. So I would imagine, yeah, we would have to do it from 1798 and theirs.
I was going back and just looking at a few things, but hadn't really found anything yet. There was a couple of living in British colonies, 1750 to 1850. So I was seeing where they wind up not being ruled by the British anymore eventually. So, and it's in the mid 1800s.
Does anybody else have an opinion on that? Joanna?
And I haven't read much of that tonight.
So we know that Turkey is the United States and France is Russia. Is that the application that we make? King of the North, King of the South?
Yeah, say it again.
So Turkey is the king of the North?
Yeah, yes.
And Egypt is the South, right? Or France?
Right.
Okay.
And then you have a hymn.
Which is?
That's what I'm thinking is Islam the hymn. You have a king.
No, I'm talking about 1798 history.
Oh, 1798?
Yeah.
Yeah, Turkey. Josiah Litch refers to it as Syria, but it's Syria ruled by Turkey.
King of the North and the king of the South?
Is Egypt. Yeah.
Is Egypt. And what's France?
And France is him.
Him. And then so who's Britain?
I don't know who Britain is. Britain is the king of the North and king of the South we have, and him is France, but Britain was the reason that Napoleon went to this Egypt expedition.
But this is the problem we're going to have, because we only have 2 players in our time plus the Middle East. And in their time, they had France, they had Syria with Ottoman, they had Egypt, they had Britain, they had India. So we need to figure out how that applies in our time, and how that applies in the 1840s too, like how that progresses, because there's a lot of extra players that we don't have, which is
I
struggle with right now.
I know.
Isn't there still only 2 sides? No, because everybody always takes sides, right? And there's always 2 sides, and you've got all the players aren't they both on separate sides?
Yeah, because actually when you bring in the British and you bring in India, you also bring in the Christian nations as well that come in as part of that later on in 1840. So you've got all these, but I think what you're saying is correct, because you ultimately only have 2 sides. It's just who's on what side with who.
Right, because right now, we could throw in, all our allies. Well, we don't have any anymore, but, the Europe and the UN, and, so it depends on how we're looking at that. It's still always just 2 sides.
And Turkey, the British supported Turkey in that history.
Right, exactly. Right, Adriana?
It sounds like a reverse proxy, which is weird, because in our time, it's the king of the North and the king of the South who work through proxies in the Middle East. But in that time, it's Britain and France working through the king of the North and the king of the South.
Different proxy.
Weird.
So sometimes we have proxies upon proxies, right?
That's not what this is, though. This is backwards.
Uh-huh.
It seems like, but I have to look into this myself, because I get a lot more out of it when I look into things.
Yeah, I do too.
Well, we look forward to you bringing back more. And then probably Wednesday, because I don't think we have anybody on the schedule for Wednesday. So probably Wednesday we'll look at and it's not a real long history unless I find anything else to put in with it. Maybe we'll be able to do both of them. Trying to find the schedule here real quick. The Syrian war, the 10-year Syrian war, we'd probably be able to cover both of them on Wednesday.
Okay, should be a good study then.
And it's just history again as well. And so anybody that wants to also maybe take on looking, because that period of time from 1801, he returns back to France and he goes on to the other things he does until he's gone in 1814, I think, or 1815. But what he did there when he was in Egypt brought modernization to the Middle East. And it also it brought this power vacuum in Egypt that gave rise as well to, I want to say Islam, not to be Islam, but that gave rise to this power there that then eventually they wind up fighting. There were several battles. That's what the time, I'm trying to remember because I did these all over the last few weeks. That was at the time of the Greek independence. I think I talked to Adriana briefly about that, or maybe on a Bible study. In the time of the Greek independence war, which was before the 1831. And it was the Greek independence war that Ottoman Empire or Turkey had. There was an agreement that if I remember right, they would give Syria to Egypt because Egypt wanted control of the Levant and wanted control of Syria. And so then the Ottoman Empire didn't give it to them, and then they went to war. So in between 1801 and 1831, there were issues that were stirring to bring about the Syrian war in 1831. So we should be able to see on our line events that took place after 1989 that led up to, be able to trace the events that led up to 2011 in Arab Spring. It was interesting to see. There's things that I'm so no history whatsoever. It was just interesting to learn that there were democracies going on, and that's what the all fight was. Maybe you guys can laugh at me, but I knew nothing. But there's all these different types of governments. But one thing that I've been seeing in all this, and you can Google or YouTube different videos on each of these battles as well. And that's what I did. Plus, I went through Bitter Rivals a few different times in the Crown Prince as well. But you can see how God is lining up in all these various nations the same issues, and how the issues of I thought all that strictness was always in the Middle East, that strictness with women, and it wasn't always. There were times where women were driving, and I kind of knew some of that, but never paid attention to it. But they wanted that. There was that radical group that wanted the religious rule over everything, and the other ones wanted democracy and freedom. So you got the same issues that are going on in various parts of the world, and that's why when Tess has been talking about knowing what things are going to look like and how it's all going to happen, you've got the same scenario, it seems like, because I think that Adriana's looked at India more than I have at this current time. But
I did?
Somewhat. When it comes to a religious war?
No, India wasn't, no. I was looking at the United States because there's this book that I've been listening to where it's talking about how basically missionary work started in the history of the Christian church, and it was with evangelicals in the United States when they decided to spread their gospel all over the world, and they inserted themselves into the Middle East and all the businesses there. and caused the whole ruckus. And that's where the first characteristic started of them going into Middle Eastern countries and not following their rules, because their rules were centered around their religion. And then they called it Christian persecution. And then they try to get the America and whoever else to fight them and beat them down so they can continue spreading their gospel. So that same characteristic that is there now with what they're doing with the International Religious Freedom Act was there in the 1800s. So that's the only thing that I've been looking at with that, and from that perspective, and all the things revolving around that, which I thought was really interesting. But
Well, I don't know. I know I'm not completely alone here, but it's a challenge to juggle all these things in your mind, in my mind all the time. And especially when we look, as we keep going through Islam and go through Brother Itabo's notes, you have Josiah Litch's actual history there. Josiah Litch combines the history of Daniel 11:40 with Revelation 9 and 11. And so you have the woes going on with a completely different line than this line here that we're trying to work on. And it's hard to keep all these different things juggled all at once in your mind. I don't know about you guys, but I know I struggle with it sometimes. But if anybody has any other questions or comments, we can close in prayer.
thank you, Elaine.
Yeah. I don't feel like I already did anything, but we go through a lot of history.
Great study.
So
No, it's hard to find some of these articles. This is really important.
well, that one Syrian one, the one that I read, yeah, because that shows us as we're getting, now we're at the end here, gives us light on the king of the south and his fall that's coming. That he played himself into a corner and got himself in trouble. So would Brother Fell, would you like to close us in prayer?
Certainly. And thank you for the study. Our loving Father, who art in heaven, Lord, we come to give you thanks for another wonderful Sabbath day that you have given to us, a day where we can freely worship you, a day where we can come together and fellowship and learn about all the things that you are showing us and reminding us how you are leading us. And we're just in awe, Father, of there's so much information and so much information with so many different factions, so many different routes, and how you're just bringing all things together. And although it's not all clear where all this is going and how this is going to culminate in clarity, Lord, we're hanging on for the ride. We're here for the journey. We're here for the ride. We just trust in you, Lord, to show us day by day. We don't need to know where we're at tomorrow or the next day. We just need to hang on for today, because we know eventually the answer is going to come and you're going to show us, Lord, and we're going to look back. We're going to look back at where we were, the times that when we thought we were in confusion, and we're going to know, Lord, how you have led us so brilliantly and so wisely. So all we can do now, Lord, is just to thank you. And we just pray, Lord, that not one of us will fall off the path, that we'll keep on trusting you, and just follow your lead, because that's all we can do, Lord. You have given each of us a different area of interest, different talents, and different amount of talents. And so as long as each of us do our part in support of this movement, that we'll be faithful to you, that we'll be faithful to this fellowship, we'll be faithful to this movement. Lord, we know that answer is going to come. So thank you. May you continue to keep each of us honest and faithful in doing the things that you have given us the work to do. And now, Father, we look forward to how you will continue to lead us throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of the week. And then until we meet on Wednesday, may you keep us in the work that you have us to do, that we may have something to share and benefit one another, that will bless and serve one another, for this is your kingdom. Thank you, Lord. May you continue to watch over us, protect us from the plague, from the violence around the world. Our brothers and sisters that are all around the world, may you protect each and every one of them. And we pray all these things, Lord, in the name of our wonderful Savior, your Son, Yeshua, in his name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen.